The door of the state-issued sedan closed with a flat institutional thud. It was the same sound that had punctuated every significant moment of Caleb Hadley's life for the past 10 years. The sound of a decision being made for him, the sound of a clipboard being signed, the sound of a name being checked off a list of one chapter ending and another beginning. Never with his permission, never with his vote. Arrival at the first group home, transfer to the second after the funding ran out, the departure for a court date he never understood, the return to a different bunk in a different building that smelled like the same disinfectant. And now this final closing, this last institutional door, the one that was supposed to mean freedom, but felt instead like an airlock cycling shut, ejecting him into a cold and indifferent vacuum. He was 18 years old, officially done, officially processed, officially emancipated. On his lap, a single cardboard box held the sum total of his worldly possessions. 3 changes of clothes folded with the careful precision of someone who had learned early that things could be taken from you. A worn paperback he had read maybe 100 times, the spine creased white in a dozen places. A faded photograph of 2 smiling adults he could not remember, a man with kind eyes and a woman with a dimple in her left cheek. And 1 thick manila envelope sealed with red tape, an envelope that felt heavier than everything else combined. Beside him, his sister Sophie sat very still. She was 10 years old. She clutched a threadbare stuffed rabbit in her lap, a creature she had named Mr. Buttons when she was 4 and had never let go of since. Her face was pressed against the cool glass of the back window, but she was not looking at the gray concrete walls of St. Bartholomew's Home for Children shrinking behind them. She was looking forward, at the long ribbon of highway, at a future she clearly believed her older brother was supposed to be providing. The weight of her stare was heavier than the box on his lap, heavier than the manila envelope, heavier than the 10 years of structured, sterile emptiness they were leaving behind. The social worker, Mrs. Albright, a woman with tired eyes and a permanently strained smile, adjusted her rear-view mirror and met his gaze. Her cheerfulness was a thin coat of paint over something else, something closer to relief. "Ready, Caleb?" He just nodded. Words felt like a currency he could not afford to spend. Ready for what? Ready to be the sole legal guardian of a 10-year-old girl when he was still a boy himself. Ready to drag a child he loved more than his own life across the state to claim a mysterious, unwanted inheritance. Ready to face a world that had so far only shown him its coldest shoulder. He was not ready for any of it, but he nodded anyway, because that is what you did. You nodded, you complied, you moved forward. It was the first rule of survival, and Caleb Hadley had been a fast learner. Sophie's small hand crept across the seat and found his, her fingers laced through his own tight, deliberate. Her grip was a silent question and a quiet promise all at once. He squeezed back. The car pulled onto the freeway. Pittsburgh fell away behind them, all gray river bridges and rusted steel skeletons, mills that had not made anything in decades, neighborhoods where the porch lights were already on at 4 in the afternoon. The car merged into the anonymous river of traffic, and for the first time in his memory, no one knew where Caleb and Sophie Hadley were going. No file, no caseworker, no bell. They were on their own. The silence in the car was not peaceful. It was loud, packed with the unspoken anxieties of a new beginning that felt terrifyingly like an end. Their first stop was not a new home. It was an old office building, downtown, the kind with a marble lobby that smelled of floor polish and quiet regret. The kind of building where men in suits made decisions about people who would never see the inside of it. The name on the frosted glass door read Whitaker and Sons Attorneys at Law. There was only one Whitaker now, and he looked as old as the leather-bound books that lined his walls. He was tall and stooped, with a face that seemed to have been carved out of granite and then softened over a long life by a pair of weary, observant eyes. He did not smile, but he did not offer the plastic sympathy Caleb had come to expect either. His name was Mortimer Whitaker, and when he gestured for them to sit in the 2 stiff leather chairs opposite his enormous mahogany desk, his hand was steady, Sophie's feet did not touch the floor. Mrs. Albright stood by the door, arms folded, a final fading link to the system they were leaving. Caleb? Sophie. Mortimer Whitaker's voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder rolling across a valley. I was your grandfather's attorney. I was also his friend. This was news to them. They had been told their grandparents were long gone, just like their parents. Another detail lost in the fog of a past no one had ever wanted to discuss. The lawyer slid a thick file across the desk. As you know, Caleb, upon your 18th birthday, the terms of your grandfather's will become enforceable. You are now the legal guardian of your sister and the sole inheritor of his estate. Estate. The word sounded grand, important. It conjured images of mansions and rolling green lawns. Caleb glanced at Sophie. She was watching a single dust mote spin in a sunbeam by the window, blissfully unaware of the legal weight settling on her brother's shoulders. Mortimer Whitaker cleared his throat and pulled him back. The estate consists of a single parcel of land, approximately 500 acres, in a remote unincorporated section of Hollow Ridge County, West Virginia. 500 acres. The number was so large, it stopped meaning anything. Caleb had spent his entire life in dorm rooms and cafeterias, in spaces measured in square feet, in minutes, never in acres. A flicker of something wild and unwelcome rose in his chest. Hope. A place. A real place. A place with a name on a map. Then came the other shoe. It always dropped. The land itself is undeveloped. The lawyer chose his words with the careful cadence of a man who had delivered bad news many times. Scrub and rock mostly, it has not been productive in decades, and it carries a significant liability. He drew another document from the file. Red ink bled across the top of it. There are back taxes owed, a substantial amount, $87,000. The county has filed a lien against the property and scheduled a tax auction, 90 days from today. The flicker of hope died smothered by the familiar damp weight of disappointment. Of course, it wasn't a gift, it was a debt. A trap dressed up as an inheritance, exactly the kind of trick the universe had been pulling on Caleb Hadley his entire life. There is, however, an offer. Mortimer's tone stayed neutral. A development firm, Meridian Holdings Group. They have been buying up parcels in that part of the county for several years. They have a standing offer to acquire your tract. The offer is modest, but it would clear the tax debt and leave you with a small amount of starting capital. Roughly $20,000. $20,000. To Caleb, it might as well have been $1 million. It was more money than he had ever imagined holding in one place. Enough for first month and last on an apartment somewhere. Enough for a used car that could carry them away from Pittsburgh and away from the social workers and away from the long shadow of St. Bartholomew's. Enough to put Sophie in a real school, to buy her a real bed, to give her one room with one door and one window of her own. It was the sensible choice. It was the only choice. Why do they want it? The question surprised him as it left his mouth. His voice was hoarse from disuse. Mortimer Whitaker shrugged. It was a slow, deliberate movement of his bony shoulders. Access, perhaps, water rights, mineral rights. It is hard to say with these firms. They acquire vast tracts of land. Sometimes they develop. Sometimes they hold. Sometimes they simply remove a piece of ground from the map and let it sit. His eyes lingered on Caleb a beat longer than was comfortable. Your grandfather did not trust them. He pushed 2 more items across the desk. A small brass key tarnished by decades of pocket lint and patient waiting. And a folded yellowed map, its creases gone soft with handling. Your grandfather specified that I give you these. Personally, he wanted you to see the land for yourself before you made any decision. See the land. What was there to see? A piece of worthless dirt that the county was about to repossess. A few hundred acres of Appalachian scrub that had cost his family more than it was apparently worth. But the weight of the brass key in his palm felt significant. A man Caleb had never met had held this key, had set it aside, had instructed an old lawyer to put it into the hand of an 18-year-old grandson on this exact day. That had to mean something, even if Caleb was not yet prepared to say what. Mrs. Albright has arranged for your bus tickets. Mortimer Whitaker stood, his knees cracked like dry kindling. The meeting was over. My advice, son, take the offer. Give yourselves a clean start. There is nothing for you out there. Nothing but trouble and silence. His advice was sound. It was logical. It was what any sane person would do. But as Caleb looked at the brass key in his palm, then at his sister, who had now picked up a notepad from the lawyer's desk and was quietly drawing a horse, a stubborn, illogical thought took root in his chest. A story isn't over until you've read the last page, and his grandfather, for whatever reason, had wanted him to read this one. Caleb closed his hand around the key. We'll see the land. The bus ride was a journey through descending layers of civilization. They started in the sprawling concrete heart of the city, a place of horns and frantic energy. Then came the first tier of suburbs, identical houses on identical lawns, the kind of life Caleb had only ever seen on television. After that, the strip malls and chain restaurants thinned, and the highway began to curl into hills. The trees grew thicker, the sky grew wider, a vast and different canvas of pale, fading blue. They were the only ones who stayed on the bus for the full 6 hours. Other passengers got on and off, each moving inside the orbit of their own small lives. A woman with a baby, a young soldier with a duffel bag, a pair of college kids whispering and laughing. Caleb and Sophie were celestial bodies that had been knocked from their course, hurtling toward something neither of them could see. Sophie slept for most of the ride. Her head rested on his shoulder. The bus rocked her like a slow, mechanical lullaby. Caleb stayed awake. He watched the world change outside the window. Mountains began to fold up on either side of the road, green and dense and old, the kind of mountains that had been here long before there was a country to put a name on them. He thought about the man in the photograph in his cardboard box. He thought about the grandfather he had never met. He thought about what it meant that an old lawyer in a marble building had been carrying a brass key for an 18-year-old boy. When the bus finally hissed to a stop, the place could barely be called a station. It was a gravel patch on the side of a 2-lane road marked by a single sun-bleached sign that read Pine Hollow. There was a gas station with a dusty convenience store, a single payphone half hanging off the wall, and nothing else. The air smelled different here. Pine needles, damp earth, distance. The first thing Sophie did when she stepped off the bus was stop and breathe in deep, her small chest rising and her eyes widening at a sky bigger than any she had ever known. A rusty Ford pickup truck was parked beside the gas pumps. The man in the driver's seat had a face like an apple that had been left out too long. Hollis Pruitt watched them get off the bus with eyes that were curious but not unfriendly, the eyes of a man who had decided long ago to mind his own business and expected the same courtesy in return. He did not get out. He just lifted 2 fingers in a small, economical wave. This was their prearranged ride, the final leg of the journey. He spoke in short, clipped sentences, his voice rough and dry from a long lifetime of unfiltered cigarettes. You're the kids for the old Hadley place. It was not a question. He stated it the way a man states the weather. He threw their cardboard box and 2 backpacks into the truck bed without ceremony. The Hadley place. That was their grandfather's name, a name that until 2 days ago had meant nothing to Caleb at all. They climbed into their cab. The vinyl seat was cracked and cool against Caleb's bare arms. Hollis pulled out of the gas station, heading away from the highway and into the deep folds of the hills. Heard a developer was sniffing around it. Hollis spoke without taking his eyes off the road. Want my opinion, sell it. Nothing but trouble, that land. Cursed, some folks say. Cursed. The word hung in the cab, thick as the dust kicked up by the tires. Caleb asked him what he meant. The old man just grunted. Old man Hadley was a strange one, kept to himself, built that place up. Then one day just disappeared. Folks reckon he ran afoul of someone, or just went quiet from the loneliness. He glanced sideways at Caleb. His eyes held nothing easy to read. This ain't a place for kids. The pavement gave out a few miles past the highway. The road turned into a rutted dirt track that wound up into the hills, hugging the curves of a creek that ran clear and fast over flat brown stones. The trees closed in around them. Their branches formed a high green tunnel that dappled the path in shifting columns of light and shadow. It was beautiful. It was beautiful the way a wild thing is beautiful. And like a wild thing, it offered no promises about whether it would be kind. After another 20 minutes of bouncing and rattling, Hollis pulled the truck to a stop. He pointed through the windshield with a calloused finger. This is as far as I go. Path up ahead is too washed out for the truck. Half a mile, maybe a little more. You'll see it. Caleb paid him the cash that Mrs. Albright had given them for the fare. Hollis took it without a word. His face had the careful neutrality of a man who knew what he was sending two children into. You got a way to call for help. Caleb held up the cheap burner phone he had been issued. It showed no signal at all. The little antenna icon was a flat, hopeless line. Hollis just shook his head slowly. Well, good luck to you. And with that, he reversed the truck in a careful three-point turn and drove away. The taillights flickered through the trees and were gone, and in their absence, the silence of the woods crashed back in like a wave. The only sounds were the wind in the leaves, the distant whisper of the creek, and the frantic beating of Caleb's own heart. He hoisted the cardboard box onto his shoulder. He grabbed his backpack with his free hand. He looked at Sophie. Her eyes were huge. She was taking in the wall of green, the cathedral of trees, the smell of damp earth and pine. It's like a jungle, she whispered. There was something close to awe in her voice. Come on! Caleb forced a confidence he did not feel up into his throat. Let's go find our castle. They started up the washed-out path, two orphans and a cardboard box walking toward a curse. The path was less a path and more a suggestion, a faint trail of compacted earth winding through dense undergrowth. Briars caught at their clothes. The air grew thick and humid under the canopy. The cardboard box dug painfully into Caleb's shoulder. The straps of his backpack cut into his collarbone. His shirt was soaked through with sweat by the time they had gone a quarter of a mile. Just as he was about to call for a rest, the trees thinned. They stepped into a clearing. And there it was. Their inheritance. Their estate. It was a shack. A small, squat, dilapidated shack of weathered gray pine boards. Its roof sagged in the middle like the back of an old sway-backed horse. A single window had been boarded up with mismatched planks. The door hung crookedly from one rusted hinge. A stone chimney covered in moss and time leaned sharply to one side as though it were tired of standing. This was the Hadley place. The last shred of hope Caleb had been carrying evaporated in his chest. In its place rose something colder, something that tasted like shame. He had dragged his sister across an entire state. He had refused 20,000 real dollars. For this, for a pile of rotting wood. He set the box down on the pine needles with a soft thump. He could not look at Sophie. He was too ashamed to face her disappointment. He waited for the tears. He waited for the small, wounded voice that would say, I want to go home, even though they had never had a home to go to. Instead, she walked slowly across the clearing. Her footsteps made no sound on the carpet of pine needles. She reached out one small hand and touched the rough gray wood of the shack's wall, the way you might touch the flank of a sleeping animal. It's quiet here, she said softly. Caleb finally looked at her. She was not crying. She was looking, observing, taking the place in the way a scientist takes in a specimen with wonder and patience, and a willingness to find out what it really was. That was Sophie. She had always seen the things he missed. She had found the dust mote dancing in the lawyer's intimidating office. She found the quiet now in the middle of a wilderness that should have terrified her. He took a long breath. He pushed the despair down. There would be no going back to the bus stop today. They had to at least spend the night. The door of the shack groaned in protest, but it opened. The inside was a single small room. Surprisingly dry, thick with the smell of dust and decay and the faint, dry signature of mice. A crude wooden table and a single chair stood in the center. A rusty wood-burning stove was shoved into a corner by the chimney. In the other corner, a pile of old mildewed blankets had been folded and stacked with surprising care. It was bleak, but it was shelter. While Sophie explored the single room with a child's curiosity running her fingers across the table, peering into the cold belly of the stove, Caleb began his own search. He was not sure what he was looking for. A clue, a reason, something to explain why a grandfather he had never met would leave them this. He ran his hands along the walls. He tapped on the floorboards. Most of them were solid. But near the back wall, under the corner of the pile of folded blankets, one board felt different. It was shorter than the others. When he pressed it with his palm, it gave a fraction of an inch. His heart kicked once hard against his ribs. He pried at it with his fingers. The wood splintered. He worked the edge of the brass key from the lawyer's office under the lip and levered up. The board came loose. Underneath was a dark, square cavity, perfectly cut through the floor and into a hollow beneath. Inside it lay a heavy olive-drab metal box, the kind a soldier would carry, the kind that had seen the inside of a footlocker. It was sealed with a simple steel clasp. Beside it lay a second key. This one was modern, silver, heavier than the brass key, attached to a small circular medallion of dark steel. Etched into the medallion was a stylized bird with its wings spread wide. Caleb's hands were not entirely steady when he lifted the box out. He worked the clasp. The lid sprang open with a soft metallic click. He had expected documents, maybe a few sentimental items, a pocket watch, an old photograph. What he saw made his breath stop in his throat. It was money, stacks of it, $100 bills neatly bundled, each bundle wrapped in a tight paper band. It was not $20,000. It was so much more. He did not dare count it then and there. His hands were shaking too badly. But even at a glance he knew. 40,000, maybe 50. More money than he had ever seen and ever expected to see, and he was looking at it through the rotted floor of a shack in the middle of nowhere. Beneath the stacks of cash lay a small hand-crank flashlight and one folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully. The creases were fragile. It was a hand-drawn map of the clearing. The shack was marked with a small square and the word shed. About 50 feet behind the shed, marked with the careful X, were three words written in neat block handwriting. The real house. Caleb looked up at his sister. She was watching him from the doorway. Her face was very still. "What is it?" she asked. He did not answer. He did not know how. He took the flashlight and the silver key and the strange medallion. He stood up, his knees stiff. He stepped back out into the late afternoon light of the clearing. He walked to the spot the map indicated. It was just a tangle of overgrown rhododendron and a small, rocky outcrop half buried in a low rise of earth. Nothing that looked like a house. Nothing that looked like anything at all. He pushed at the bushes with his boot, then with his hand. Then he saw it. It was not a house. It was a door, a heavy steel plate door set horizontally into the ground flush with the rock. It had been painted by someone with a great deal of patience to look exactly like the surrounding stone. Lichens, mineral streaks, even the hairline cracks. From 3 feet away, you would never see it. From 10 feet away, it did not exist. In the center of the door was a single keyhole. Beside the keyhole was a small recessed circle, just the right size for the medallion in his hand. Caleb knelt down. The cool metal of the door pressed through the knees of his jeans. He could feel the weight of it, the thickness of it. The thing was several inches of steel. It had not been put here by accident, and it had not been put here cheaply. The silver key slid into the lock. He turned it. A heavy mechanical clunk echoed from somewhere deep beneath his hand. Locks releasing, bolts retracting, old machinery waking up after a long sleep. He pressed the medallion into the recessed circle. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then somewhere below, a soft hum began. Electrical, steady, the sound of dormant systems coming back online. He felt it in his palms. He felt it in the soles of his boots. The whole rocky outcrop seemed to come alive beneath him. And then, with a hiss of pneumatic seals breaking the heavy steel door, began to rise. It opened like the lid of a clamshell, smooth and slow. A wave of cold, stale air washed over them, smelling of concrete and ozone, and something cleaner than the woods, cleaner than the world above. Beneath the rising lid, a set of steep concrete steps descended into a darkness so absolute that the late afternoon light could not seem to reach the third stair down. Sophie had come up behind him without making a sound. She slipped her small hand into his. "Caleb." Her voice was very quiet. "Yeah. What is it?" He stared down into the dark. His grandfather had not been a strange man who had simply gone mad from the loneliness, the way Hollis Pruitt had said. His grandfather had been a man with a secret, a very large, very deliberate, very expensive secret. A secret that he had locked away inside the rock of his own land, and a secret that he had decided would only be unsealed by a brass key carried in an old lawyer's drawer for a grandson's 18th birthday. "I think," Caleb said slowly, "this is the real house." He clicked on the hand-crank flashlight. Its beam was weak and yellow but steady, and he aimed it down the steps. The light caught smooth gray walls, a clean concrete floor, a second door at the bottom. He looked at his sister. "Stay close," he whispered. Together they took the first step down. The descent felt like entering another world. The air grew cooler with each step. The silence grew more profound until he could hear nothing but the soft drag of his own breathing and the careful tread of Sophie's sneakers behind him. The concrete stairs were steep and narrow-walled and smooth, poured concrete. He counted them as he went. 20, 25, 30 steps down. At the bottom they stood in a small entryway. Another heavy steel door waited for them. There was no handle, only a small recessed panel on the wall with a single large red button glowing faintly behind a layer of dust. He hesitated. Every instinct he had honed inside the system screamed at him to be cautious, to distrust unknown rooms, to distrust unknown men, to distrust gifts that were too good to be true. But he had come this far. He pressed the button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a low hum started somewhere behind the wall. A series of satisfying clicks, locks disengaging in sequence. A strip of light appeared along the top of the door, and then all at once, the entire space beyond it flooded with steady fluorescent light. The power was on. The door slid silently into the wall. It was not a damp, cramped cellar. It was not a survivalist's hole. It was a home. A strange, sterile, windowless home, but a home nonetheless. A long hallway stretched out in front of them, painted a soft, calming gray. The air was being moved by a quiet ventilation system. Their footsteps echoed softly on smooth tile as they walked. Doors lined either side of the hallway. The first one opened into a compact, efficient kitchen. A stove, a small refrigerator, cupboards stocked with neatly labeled cans of beans and soup and freeze-dried meals. A coffee can on the counter, its lid still sealed. Everything was covered in a thin coat of dust, but otherwise it had been preserved as though its owner had only just stepped out for a walk. Another door opened into a bathroom, a working shower, folded towels. Another door revealed a small bedroom, two neatly made bunks, the blankets pulled tight with military corners. Two bunks, one for him, one for her. Caleb's throat closed up. At the end of the hall, they stepped into a larger room, a living area and study combined, a comfortable-looking couch, a bookshelf packed tight with leather spines. Engineering, history, cryptography, American military codes of the 20th century, field manuals, a large desk in the center of the room, and on that desk, placed squarely in the middle, sat a vintage cassette tape recorder. Beside it, a stack of cassette tapes, each one meticulously labeled in neat block handwriting. Beside them, a thick leather-bound journal. Folded neatly across the back of the desk chair, an old olive green military jacket, and on top of the jacket, a pair of dog tags on a thin steel chain. Caleb walked to the desk slowly. He felt the way a man feels when he steps into a church he has never seen before. Sophie stayed near the door watching, holding Mr. Buttons against her chest. He picked up the dog tags. He turned them in the light. The metal was worn smooth on the edges from decades of being carried in a chest pocket, but the stamping was still clear. Hadley W. U.S. Army. He closed his fist around them. He could feel the chain warm in his hand, as though it had been waiting to be lifted again. He set them gently on the desk. He picked up the topmost tape from the stack. The label in the same precise block handwriting, the map read, "For Caleb and Sophie. Play this first." His hands were shaking now. He did not bother to hide it. Sophie was watching him, and he wanted her to know that he was afraid because he wanted her to know that being afraid was not a thing to be ashamed of. He sat down in his grandfather's chair. He gestured for Sophie to come and sit on the couch across from him. She did, curling her small body up like a question mark. He inserted the tape into the machine. He pressed play. The speakers hissed for a long second. Then a voice filled the underground room. A man's voice, low, calm, carrying the slow, deliberate weight of a man who had thought very carefully about every word he was about to say. "Caleb, Sophie, if you are hearing this, then I am gone, and you have found your way home." Home. The word struck Caleb in the chest like a fist. He had never been called home before. Not the orphanage, not the group homes, not the foster placements between with their bunk beds and chore charts and rules about which cabinet held the cereal. None of it had ever been home. The voice on the tape continued. "My name is Arthur Walter Hadley. Your friends will know me as Whit. I am your grandfather. I know you have questions. I know you have likely spent your lives believing that I abandoned you. That is the story I was forced to leave behind. The story they wanted you to read. The story that kept you alive." Caleb's vision blurred. He could not seem to take a full breath. He gripped the edge of the desk. "There is a great deal you need to know about your father, your mother, about the night they died, about the men who killed them, and about why I have spent the last decade of my life living in this concrete room beneath your feet, less than 100 miles from where you slept." Sophie made a small sound. Caleb could not look at her. He could not look at anything except the slow, steady turning of the cassette spools. "I never left you, son." The voice paused. The tape hissed in the silence. "I was here the whole time, under your feet, listening to the wind move through the same trees you would one day stand under, counting the days until you would be old enough and strong enough and ready enough to come home and finish what I could not." Another pause, a breath. The voice on the tape, suddenly older, suddenly more tired, suddenly more human. "What I am about to tell you about how your father and your mother died is going to change everything you thought you knew. About them, about me, about the world they left you in, and about the choice you are now standing in front of." The tape hissed, the reels turned, and then with a soft mechanical click, the cassette stopped. Side A had ended. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The ventilation moved cool air across the back of Caleb's neck. Somewhere deep in the bunker, a refrigerator compressor cycled on with a quiet shudder. Caleb sat very still in his grandfather's chair in the underground room that no one outside of their tiny broken family knew existed, holding a pair of dog tags warm from his palm and staring at a cassette tape that had just told him his entire life was a lie. Sophie watched him from the couch. Her eyes were wet but unblinking. Her arms were wrapped around the threadbare rabbit she had carried out of the orphanage that morning in what felt now like another century. "Caleb," she said. Her voice was very small. He nodded. He could not yet speak. He reached out slowly and turned the tape over. Side B was waiting. So was the truth. Caleb let his hand hover over the cassette for a long moment. The plastic was cool under his fingertips. The label hand-printed in the same neat block letters read, Side B on the side, now facing up. The reels inside were perfectly still. Whatever was on the second half of that tape had been waiting in this concrete room for years, with the patience of stone for an 18-year-old boy to sit down in this chair and decide whether he was ready to hear it. He was not ready. He pressed play anyway. The speakers hissed. The reels began to turn, and the voice of Arthur Walter Hadley returned to fill the underground room. I did not work in insurance, Caleb. That was the cover story. That was the line written on the school forms, on the income tax returns, on the policies your father grew up watching me sign at the kitchen table. It was a lie, a useful, ordinary, bureaucratic lie. The voice paused. For the first part of my life, I was a soldier. Caleb's eyes went almost without his permission to the olive green jacket draped across the back of the chair, to the dog tags resting on the desk in front of him. He had known even as a boy in the orphanage that he came from somewhere. Every child in St. Bartholomew's knew that, even the ones who never said it aloud. But knowing abstractly that you had a grandfather who had served, and hearing his voice tell you so from a recording made years before your 18th birthday, were not the same thing. Not even close. I served in the United States Army, Signal Intelligence. I spent my 20s and most of my 30s at a listening post outside Berlin during the Cold War. My job was to find patterns in chaos, to read the shape of things from the noise around them. Most men who do that kind of work for long enough learn one of two things. Either they learn to stop listening, or they learn that they cannot stop. I was the second kind. A breath, the voice on the tape softened. After the service, I was recruited into a quiet branch of the National Security Agency. For 30 years, that is who I worked for. Officially, I was a paper pusher, a man with a gray suit and a parking pass and a window that did not open. Unofficially, I read the world's secret conversations, domestic and foreign. Most of it was noise. Most of it was nothing. Most of it was the dull background hum of a country trying to govern itself. The tape hissed, and then one day I found a signal. Caleb leaned forward in his grandfather's chair without realizing he was doing it. Across the room, Sophie sat very still on the couch, her arms wrapped around her stuffed rabbit. The fluorescent lights hummed. The ventilation breathed. It was a pattern, a small repeating pattern hidden inside a routine government communications channel. At first, I thought it was a glitch, a relay error, the kind of artifact you learn to ignore, but I had spent 40 years not ignoring things, so I followed it. A long pause. It was not foreign chatter. It was not espionage. It was not a hostile power. It was domestic. It was a small group of very wealthy, very powerful men, titans of finance and industry, men whose names you would know if you read the business section of any newspaper in this country. They were using a protected government communications network to coordinate a program of fraud on a scale I had never seen. Manipulating markets, bankrupting competitors on schedule, moving money through shell corporations the way other men move pieces on a chessboard, ruining lives by the thousands, all of it for their own enrichment, all of it accountable to no one. The voice grew quieter. They called themselves Meridian, after the line on a map, the line you cross when you have decided you are above the rest of the country. Caleb's blood went cold in his veins. Meridian Holdings Group, the development firm offering $20,000 for 500 acres of cursed land. The company Mortimer Whitaker had named that very morning in a marble office hundreds of miles from this concrete room. The company that wanted his inheritance. He looked at Sophie. She was watching the tape recorder with her small face perfectly still, the way a deer watches a sound in the brush. I took my findings to my superior. A bitter pause. He told me to drop it. He told me these men were untouchable. He told me, in a voice I had heard before from other men in other rooms, that there were larger considerations, that national stability required certain kinds of silence, that I should think of my pension, that I should think of my family. A beat, I had the proof, I had names, I had account numbers. I had the architecture of the entire conspiracy mapped on 3 reels of magnetic tape and a single hand-typed manuscript. I had spent 35 years of my life learning how to listen, and I was not about to unlearn it now because some bureaucrat told me to think of my pension. Another beat, heavier. So I made a copy. The voice stopped. When it came back, it was different. There was a roughness in it that had not been there before, a grief that had lived in that room for years. That was my mistake, Caleb. That was the line I crossed. Because the day I made that copy was the day I became a man with leverage. And men like that, men with leverage over Meridian, do not stay alive for long. A breath. On the morning I was scheduled to meet with a journalist, your parents got into their car. They were on their way to drive your father, my son Daniel, to a conference. He was 29 years old. Your mother, Rebecca, was 27. You were 8. Your sister was 9 months. Sophie did not move. Caleb's vision blurred. He had not heard their names spoken aloud in years. His parents existed for him as a single faded photograph and the smell of someone else's perfume in the corner of a memory. Daniel and Rebecca, 2 names suddenly in his grandfather's voice. The brake lines had been cut, not the way you see in movies, cleanly, carefully, by someone who knew exactly how a hydraulic system fails under load. The investigators called it brake failure. The insurance company called it tragic. The newspapers called it an accident. I called it what it was, a message. The voice cracked just slightly. They were showing me they could reach anyone. They could reach your mother in a parking lot. They could reach your father at a stoplight. They could reach you in your bed. They could reach Sophie in her crib. They had decided to make me watch, and they were not yet finished. The tape hissed. I could not go to the FBI. The FBI's electronic communications ran across the same network I had been monitoring for 30 years. I had no way of knowing which agents were clean and which were already part of the problem. I could not go to the press because the journalist I had been planning to meet was found 3 days later in a hotel room in Virginia. The official cause was self-inflicted. I never believed it for a moment. Caleb's hands had begun to shake. I could not run because they would find me. They had the resources of a small nation. They had connections inside every agency that might have helped me. I had 35 years of training in how to disappear, and even I knew that running was not enough. A long pause, the longest yet. So I did the only thing left to do. I disappeared on my own terms. The voice steadied. I used what I knew about the system to erase myself. I staged a boating accident off the coast of Maryland. I left clothes on the beach, a wallet, a boat with the engine still running. The Coast Guard searched for 3 days. They never found a body. The state declared me legally dead 9 months later. I was buried in absentia with a small stone in a churchyard outside Annapolis beside a wife I had loved and lost 20 years before. Beside the parents I had buried before her. The Hadley plot was filled. A breath. I came here, to this land, the Hadley homestead, a piece of ground that had been in our family since before there was a country called America. I built this place with my own hands and with the help of one man and with the part of my old work that taught me how to make rooms that do not appear on any map. I lined the walls with concrete. I sealed it. I made it a fortress. And I waited. The voice gentled the way a voice gentles only when it is speaking to children. And I did the cruelest thing I have ever done in my life, the thing that has cost me more than the war did, more than your grandmother's death did, more than burying my own son did. I put you and your sister into the state system because the state system was the one place Meridian would never look. A boy and a girl with no last name worth tracing. Lost in a bureaucracy of forms and case numbers. Anonymous, forgotten, safe. Caleb's throat closed up. The voice on the tape went on. Every birthday I missed. Every Christmas I did not visit. Every time you ran a fever in a strange bed, every time Sophie cried in a room I could not enter, I have stood in this room with my hand on this concrete wall and known exactly where you were. And I have stayed where I was. Because every day I let you grow up alone was another day they did not come for you. And there is no kind of love crueler than that, Caleb. To love someone enough to be misunderstood by them for 10 years. To choose every morning not to reach for the phone, not to send the letter, not to drive to that gray building in Pittsburgh and put my hand on the glass. The voice paused. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am only telling you the truth. The tape hissed. This bunker, this land, what I have left here for you is your birthright. But it is also a weapon. The choice of what to do with it is now yours. And I want you to understand before you make it and that there is no choice I will be angry with you for making. Whatever you decide as a free man. The first one in this family in 3 generations. Another breath. In a moment the tape will end. There is a journal on the desk. There is more on the other tapes. There is a room at the end of the hall behind a door you have not yet opened. The same key will fit. The same medallion. What is in that room is the rest of the story. The part I could not say out loud, not even to myself. A pause. I am sorry, my children, for everything. A click. The reel stopped. The hiss faded. The fluorescent lights hummed. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Caleb stared at the cassette deck. His vision had gone glassy and far. His chest felt as though something very large and very old had been lifted out of it, and something else had been laid down in its place. Heavier, more dangerous, more precious. His parents had been murdered. His grandfather had been alive the entire time, less than a day's drive from where he and Sophie had eaten cafeteria chicken nuggets and slept in bunk beds. And the company offering them $20,000 for 500 acres of useless land was the same company that had cut the brake lines on his father's car. He felt Sophie's hand before he saw her. She had crossed the room without making a sound the way she did. She had climbed up onto the arm of his chair. Her fingers, small and cool, slipped into his. She did not speak for a long moment. Then very softly she said, "So they didn't crash." It was not a question. It was a fact she was saying out loud so that she could begin to learn how to live with it. Caleb shook his head. His voice would not come. "And Grandpa was here," she said, "the whole time." He nodded. Her small face went very still. Then slowly, deliberately, she leaned her forehead against his shoulder. He felt the warmth of her breath through the cotton of his shirt. He felt the wetness of a tear that she did not intend for him to see. He had thought all the way down the bus ride, all the way up the rutted dirt road, all the way through the rotted door of the shack above them, that he was going to be the one taking care of her. He realized now, sitting in his grandfather's chair under fluorescent light, that it had never been one direction. She was holding him too. She had always been holding him. He had simply been too proud or too afraid to notice. He stood up. His knees were not entirely steady. He set the dog tags down carefully on the desk beside the journal. He walked to the bookshelf. He turned his back to his sister so that she would not see him. He cried for a long time. He cried for the parents whose names he had learned today for the first time, Daniel and Rebecca. He cried for the grandfather who had spent 10 years in a concrete room less than 100 miles from where he had slept. He cried for the boy he had been who had thought he was unwanted. He cried for the man he was going to have to become before the night was over. When he was finished, he wiped his face on his sleeve. He turned back to the room. Sophie was waiting. She had moved to the couch. She had picked up the leather-bound journal. She held it on her with the care of a child holding a wounded bird. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah." "He left us a choice." She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright. "What do we do?" He looked for a long second at the door at the end of the hallway, the northernmost door. He took a breath. "Let's see what's in the other room." The lock turned smoothly. The medallion seated cleanly into its recess. The third door slid back into its frame with the same quiet hydraulic sigh as the others. Cool, drier air met them. A different kind of air, the air of a vault. Caleb stepped inside first. Sophie stayed close behind him. The room was small, climate-controlled. A bank of dehumidifiers hummed at low power along the wall. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with steel shelving. Each shelf held neat rows of fireproof document cases, each one labeled in the same neat block hand. Years, names, code names, the entire architecture of a 35-year investigation organized the way an old soldier organizes a footlocker. That was one wall. The second wall was covered in cork, edge to edge, and the cork was covered in photographs and documents and red yarn. It was a conspiracy board. It was a map of the enemy. Faces stared down at Caleb from the cork. Men in suits, men on yachts, men shaking hands at fundraisers, men whose faces he half recognized from the front pages of newspapers in the lobby of the orphanage. Lines of red yarn connected them. Names flowed beneath their faces in neat block capitals. Beneath several of them, there were small clipped news photographs of business sections of mergers, of bankruptcies, of suicides ruled accidental. And in the center of the cork wall, slightly larger than the rest, was a single photograph. A man in his late 50s, silver hair, a square jaw, the kind of face designed to be reassuring in a boardroom. The name beneath it read, Thaddeus Sterling, CEO, Meridian Holdings Group. A red yarn line ran from his photograph down and to the left to a small index card pinned at chest height. The card read D&R Hadley, RT, July 14th. Caleb stopped breathing. That was the date his parents had died. He had memorized it once in the orphanage the way a child memorizes a poem to keep something safe. It had been printed on a court document the caseworker had read aloud when he was 9 years old. Route 19, July 14th. His grandfather had drawn a line with a piece of red yarn from the face of Thaddeus Sterling to the date his son and daughter-in-law had been killed. The third wall of the vault was money. Stacked floor to ceiling, shrink-wrapped bricks of $100 bills, not bundles. Bricks. So much cash that it stopped looking like money and started looking like an obscenity. Caleb did not try to count it. Counting was beside the point. The point was that this was what they had been hunting. This was what they had been killing for. On a small metal table beside the door sat a closed laptop, a single hard drive, a stack of 3 external backups, a folded piece of paper. Caleb picked up the paper. It was a note, 2 paragraphs in his grandfather's hand. Caleb, this is everything, the full ledger, every name, every transfer, every false bankruptcy, every life. The hard drive is the proof. The cash is their weapon. They will offer you safety. They will offer you a comfortable life if you sell this land and forget my name. Their offer is honest in its way. They will pay. They will leave you alone. You and Sophie can go anywhere in this country and live well for the rest of your lives. That is one path. The other path is the one that ends them. Meridian believes the proof is here. They are correct. They have been buying every parcel around this land for 10 years. The offer for our acres is the last move on a long board. If you take it, the proof goes with the land, and the men on these walls go on living the way they have always lived. If you refuse it, they will know, and they will not ask politely a second time. Whatever you choose it because it is yours to choose. I have done what I can. W. Caleb set the note down with hands that were no longer trembling. A new kind of stillness had settled in him. Not peace, something colder, a clarity. He looked at his sister. Sophie was standing in front of the cork wall. She had not yet seen the wall of money. Her attention had gone the way her attention always went to the thing other people would have missed. She was looking at the photographs of his parents. They were pinned in the upper left corner of the board. 2 small faded snapshots of the kind that came out of a 1-hour photo machine in 1995. His father in a flannel shirt holding a fishing rod grinning. His mother in a hospital bed holding a baby. The baby was Sophie. His sister stood in front of those photographs, and looked at them for a long time. "That's our mom," she said finally. "I was right." He had not known what she had been right about. He realized all at once that she had been carrying her own theories, her own quiet investigations into the fog of their childhood. She had told him once when she was 6 that she could remember the smell of their mother's hair. He had thought she was making it up. He realized now she probably had not been. "Yes," he said. His voice was rough. "That's our mom." She nodded slowly. She turned. She saw the wall of money for the first time. She did not gasp. She did not laugh. She did not run her hand across the bricks. She just looked at it for a long moment, the way she had looked at the boarded-up shack in the empty clearing. "That's a lot of money," she said. "Yeah. Is it ours?" He thought about it honestly. "Some of it," he said. "Some of it is ours. The rest is complicated." He knelt down. He did this so that he was at her eye level. He did this because he was about to ask her a question that no 10-year-old in any reasonable country should ever have to be asked, and because he wanted her to know he saw her. Truly, not as a burden, not as a charge, as a partner. "Sophie, listen to me." She listened. "Grandpa gave us 2 paths. We can take the money in the shed and walk away. We can take a good piece of this money in this room, too. We can find a town somewhere far away, anywhere you want. We can buy a little house. You can go to a real school. We can be safe." She watched him. Isha, or, she said, "we can stay. We can use what's in this room. We can fight the men who killed our parents. And it will not be safe. It will be very, very dangerous. For a long time. It might even be dangerous for you." He waited. She did not look away from him. "But the bad men would get away with it," she said. "The other way." It was not a question. It was the simple, devastating logic of a child who had never learned to lie to herself about the shape of right and wrong. She had not had the luxury. The system had cured her of it early. "Yes," he said, "they would. They'd get this place. They'd get our family's land. They'd put a parking lot on top of Grandpa's bunker. And they'd never answer for what they did to Mom and Dad." She thought about that. She walked slowly to the metal table. She touched the cool plastic shell of the hard drive. She traced one small finger down its edge. Grandpa was brave. Yes. He was alone for a long time. Yes. She looked at him. Her eyes had something in them he had never seen before in any of the children he had grown up with. A decision. "We have to be brave too, right, Caleb?" And there it was. The choice was not made by him, the 18-year-old in the corner of the room, the man with the brass key in his pocket and the dog tags on the desk and the crushing weight of a 500-acre inheritance on his shoulders. The choice was made by a 10-year-old girl in a borrowed coat holding a stuffed rabbit standing in a vault full of money beneath a mountain in West Virginia. All his fear, his exhaustion, his temptation to take the cash and run fell away. He stood up. He did not have to force a smile this time. It came on its own. "Yeah," he said, "we have to be brave too." He walked back through the hallway, past the bedroom with the 2 bunks, past the kitchen with its careful cans, past the study where the cassette tapes lay in their patient stack. He picked up the dog tags from the desk. He hesitated for a long second. Then he slipped the chain over his head. The metal settled against his sternum, close and steady. The chain was just slightly too long for him. It was size for a man. He would have to grow into it. That seemed appropriate. He picked up the leather journal. He picked up the satellite phone case from the corner of the desk. He picked up the silver key with the medallion, and he put it in his pocket beside the brass one. He turned to his sister. "All right," he said, "let's go to work." The first thing they did was eat. They had not eaten since the bus station. Sophie had been carrying a granola bar in her backpack since Pittsburgh. They split it on the floor of the kitchen, sitting cross-legged, with their backs against the cool steel of the refrigerator. He found a sealed jar of peanut butter in the cupboard, a box of saltines. 2 cans of fruit cocktail. They ate in silence. The food tasted strange in the way clean food always tastes strange as someone whose palate has been calibrated by institutional cafeterias. He realized halfway through his second cracker that this was the first private meal of his adult life. No tray, no line, no bell. He could feel his sister watching him eat. He saw her out of the corner of his eye mimic the way he held the saltine, the way he chewed, the way he set the cracker down between bites. She had been doing that her whole life, he understood, following him, reading him, calibrating off of him. He was going to have to be very, very careful from now on about what shape he gave her to follow. After they ate, he washed 2 glasses in the small sink, and they drank cold water from a tap that had been waiting 10 years to be turned on. Then they walked back to the study. He sat down at the desk. He opened the leather-bound journal. The first page was a continuation of his grandfather's message. The handwriting was dense. Every line was filled. There were no margins, no wasted space. The journal was thick. He read for a long time. Sophie curled up on the couch with one of the books from the shelf, A Field Guide to the Birds of the Eastern United States. She turned the pages slowly. She did not interrupt him. He learned that night more about his family in 3 hours than he had learned in 18 years. He learned the names of his great-grandparents. The first Hadleys to clear ground on this ridge in 1887, he learned that the brass key had belonged to his great-grandmother, that she had used it to lock a tin box in which she had kept her Bible and her marriage certificate, that his grandfather had kept the key after she died the way men keep things that have been touched by women they have loved. He learned that his father Daniel had wanted to be a teacher, that he had taken a job at an insurance firm only because Caleb had been born and there were bills, that he had been planning to go back to school, that he had told his father the last time they spoke that he was happy, that he had said it twice like a man trying to make sure something was on the record. He learned that his mother, Rebecca, had come from a small town in eastern Tennessee, that she had a cousin once removed married to a man named Roland Fletcher, that his grandfather had written this name in the journal 3 separate times at 3 separate years with a small notation each time. Married into Meridian, may yet matter. He learned a great many things he had not known he wanted to know. By the time the journal slid out of his hands and his head fell forward against his fist on the desk, the fluorescent lights had dimmed automatically to a soft amber. The bunker had decided it was night. Caleb did not remember falling asleep. He woke with his cheek against the journal and his neck bent at a painful angle. Sophie had pulled a blanket from the bunk room and laid it across his shoulders. She was asleep on the couch, the field guide open on her chest, Mr. Buttons tucked beneath her chin. The bunker breathed quietly around them. He sat up. He listened to the silence. He felt the weight of the dog tags against his sternum. He thought about his grandfather sitting in the same chair 10 years ago, hearing the silence settle around him for the first time, choosing in this room to trade his name for the safety of 2 grandchildren he could not hold. He thought about his father, 29 years old, getting into a car with bad brake lines. He thought about Thaddeus Sterling. The choice he had agreed to last night with his sister settled into his bones in a way that no choice had ever settled in him before. It did not feel like a decision anymore. It felt like a fact about himself, as fixed as his height, as fixed as his name. He stood up. He folded the blanket carefully back over Sophie. He climbed the concrete steps. He came up out of the earth into a clearing that had been waiting for someone to walk back across it. The morning was very cold. The sky above the ridge was a high, thin blue, the kind of blue that only exists in the mountains. The wind moved in the pines like a long, slow breath. Somewhere in the trees, a hawk called. He carried the satellite phone in his hard case to the rocky outcrop, where his grandfather had said the signal would be best. He set it on the stone. He extended the antenna. He waited. The signal indicator climbed slowly to 2 bars. He pulled the business card Mortimer Whitaker had given him out of the back pocket of his jeans. He dialed the number. The phone rang 3 times. A gruff voice answered on the 4th. Whitaker. Mr. Whitaker, it's Caleb Hadley. There was a pause. The lawyer's voice softened just slightly with something that might have been surprise. Caleb, have you made a decision? He breathed in the cold air of the ridge. He felt the dog tag settle against his sternum under his shirt. He looked across the clearing at the rotted gray shack that stood above 500 acres of his family's blood and silence and patient planted truth. Yes, sir, he said. I've made a decision. What would you like me to tell Meridian? The wind moved in the pines. Tell them no. The line went very quiet. Mr. Whitaker? Yes, son. I need you to come out here. There's something you need to see. Something my grandfather left for me. For us. It changes everything. A long silence on the other end of the line. When the old lawyer spoke again, his voice had changed. The polite distance of a man delivering bad news to a client was gone. Something else had come into it. Something sharper. Something younger. Tomorrow he had, I will be at the end of your road, alone. Thank you, sir. Caleb. Yes, sir. You should know. Refusing them is a door you cannot close again. He thought about that. I know, he said. He ended the call. He folded the antenna. He sat on the cold rock of the outcrop in the high, thin blue of an Appalachian morning in a body that no longer felt like a boy's body. The first shot had been fired. There was no going back now. Behind him, half hidden in the rhododendron, the camouflaged steel hatch of his grandfather's bunker waited the way it had waited for 10 years for the next thing to happen. Below him in the concrete room, his sister slept. Above them all, somewhere in a glass office in a city he had never seen, a man named Thaddeus Sterling was about to be told that an 18-year-old orphan had said no. The war had begun, and Caleb Hadley, for the first time in his life, was no longer alone in it. Mortimer Whitaker arrived the next day at noon exactly. He came in a dark sedan that did not belong on a country road. He parked it at the end of the gravel where Hollis Pruitt's truck had stopped 2 days before. He stepped out into the cold mountain air in a charcoal suit and polished black shoes, and he stood for a long moment looking at the wall of trees ahead of him with the expression of a man who understood perhaps for the first time the gap between a courtroom and a forest. Caleb was waiting on the fallen log where he had sat the day before. He stood when he saw the car. The dog tags were under his shirt now, the chain warm against his collarbone where it had spent the night. The lawyer walked the last 20 yards on his own. His shoes were already losing their polish to the dust. Caleb. Mr. Whitaker. The old lawyer looked at him for a long second. Something in his face had shifted since the marble office in Pittsburgh. He was not looking at a client anymore. He was looking at a young man. Show me, he said. The walk to the clearing was slow. Caleb listened to the labored breathing of an attorney who had spent 40 years behind a desk. He did not offer to slow down. He understood instinctively that this man needed to arrive winded, that a person who had not earned a place could not be trusted to defend it. When they stepped into the clearing, Mortimer Whitaker stopped. He stared at the gray shack. His face did not change. This is what I refused $20,000 for, Caleb said. This is what you refused $20,000 for. The lawyer agreed. Not exactly. He led the older man past the shack, past the rhododendron, to the painted rock in the camouflage seam in the ground. He used the silver key. He pressed the medallion into its recess. The hatch rose with its quiet hydraulic sigh. For a long moment, Mortimer Whitaker did not move. Then slowly he removed his hat. He held it in both hands. Arthur, he said, to no one in particular, you magnificent, stubborn old man. He went down the stairs ahead of Caleb without being asked. The tour took 2 hours. Caleb walked him through every room, the kitchen, the bunk room, the study. He played him the first cassette, then stopped it after 8 minutes, when the older man held up a hand and said quietly, I have heard enough of his voice for one day. He saved the vault for last. When the third door slid open and Mortimer Whitaker stepped into the climate-controlled room and saw the cork wall, the shelves of fireproof cases, the laptop on the metal table, and the photograph of Thaddeus Sterling pinned at the center with a single line of red yarn running down to the date. Daniel and Rebecca Hadley had died. The lawyer stood very still for a long minute. Then he walked to the wall of money. He touched one shrink-wrapped brick with 2 fingers. He did not pick it up. "How much?" he said. "I haven't counted." "Don't, not yet." He turned. He looked at Caleb across the small vault. "Do you understand what this is?" "I think so." "This is not a fraud case, son. This is sedition. This is a criminal conspiracy at the highest levels of American finance. The hard drive on that table can take down men whose names are carved into buildings in 3 cities. It can also get you killed before you finish the sentence." "I know." The old lawyer studied him for a long moment. Then without a word, he sat down on the metal stool beside the table and put his head in his hands. His shoulders shook just slightly, and Caleb realized with a kind of distant tenderness that Mortimer Whitaker was crying. "He was my friend," the lawyer said into his palms. "For 40 years he was my friend. I drank his coffee. I stood at his wife's funeral. I held his son when his son was a baby. And when they buried him in absentia, I stood at his stone and I knew. I knew Caleb. I never had the proof. He never gave me the proof. But I knew." He looked up. His eyes were red, but clear. "What are we going to do, son?" The word son did not feel patronizing. It felt like a vote. Caleb thought about it. "We're going to fight," he said, "but it has to be my fight. I'll listen to your strategy. I'll do what makes sense. But I'm the one who decides. He left this to me, not to you." A long pause. The old lawyer nodded once. "All right," he said, "then let's go to war." The first weeks moved fast. Mortimer Whitaker filed an emergency injunction in the Hollow Ridge County Courthouse, citing newly discovered estate assets in a pending federal inquiry. A puzzled small-town judge, suddenly facing white shoe attorneys he had never seen in his courtroom, granted a temporary stay on the tax auction. It was their first small victory. The lawyer drove back to Pittsburgh with a copy of the hard drive in a steel briefcase chained to his wrist. He hired a forensic accountant. He hired a cybersecurity contractor. He filed a sealed whistleblower complaint in federal court under the False Claims Act. He moved very carefully, the way a man moves who has spent 40 years watching other men get destroyed for moving carelessly. Meridian's response came quickly. Their first letter raised the offer to $50,000. The second 2 weeks later raised it to $200. The third did not raise the offer. It threatened litigation for frivolous obstruction. The fourth was a notice of intent to depose. The fifth was a surveyor on the public road taking measurements of nothing in particular in a bright orange vest. Caleb watched him from the tree line. He did not raise his voice. He did not call out. He simply stood at the edge of his 500 acres with his hand resting against the bark of a white oak and watched until the surveyor's discomfort became visible and the man got back into his truck and drove away. The land was changing him. He woke at dawn now. He cleared the path between the shed and the bunker. He repaired the rotted boards of the shack with a cedar hollis brought up from town in the back of the Ford. He tilled a small patch of earth at the edge of the clearing and put in tomatoes and squash and beans, the way the journal had said his great-grandmother used to. His hands cracked along the knuckles and bled in the dry mountain air. He bandaged them at night and let the calluses build. Sophie adapted to the strange new shape of their life with a resilience that humbled him. She claimed the lower bunk in the bunker as her kingdom. She decorated the walls of the bunk room with drawings she made on the back of old printer paper from the study. Hawks, mountains, the blue door of a house she had not yet seen built. She read her way through the field guides on the bookshelf. She started a small notebook of her own observations of the clearing, the kinds of birds, the kinds of tracks, the kinds of weather. She was the reason he did not break. In the evenings after she was asleep, he sat at his grandfather's desk and read. He read the journal. He read the simplified case summaries Mortimer was sending up by courier each week. He learned about shell corporations. He learned about layered banking. He learned the architecture of the machine they were fighting. He was no longer just the 18-year-old who had walked off a bus into the woods. He was becoming slowly something else. One evening, 6 weeks in, the satellite phone rang. It was Mortimer. "They're making an offer," he said. "They've been making offers." "Not this kind of offer." A long pause. "They want to settle. They will pay your back taxes. They will withdraw their claim on the land. They will pay you and Sophie a settlement so large that you will never have to think about money for the rest of your lives. In return, you give them the hard drive, all copies. You sign a non-disclosure agreement that will outlive your grandchildren. The lawsuit goes away. The investigation stops. All of it." Caleb stood on the rock outcrop. The sun was setting behind the ridge. The shadows of the pines were very long. "They want to buy our silence," he said. "Yes." "How much?" "Enough." "Tell me." The lawyer told him. Caleb closed his eyes. It was the kind of money that ended the story, the kind of money that put Sophie in the best schools in the country, the kind of money that could buy a house anywhere, a real house, with windows, with a blue door, with a name on the deed that no one would ever take away. It was in every measurable way the safe answer. He thought about his sister asleep in the bunker beneath his feet. He thought about his father at 29. He thought about his grandfather alone in this concrete room for 10 years, staying alive on patience and grief. "Mr. Whitaker." "Yes, son." "Tell them no." There was a long pause on the line. Then he heard very clearly the old lawyer let out a slow breath. The breath of a man who had been waiting to find out whether he was working for a kid or a Hadley. "I was hoping you'd say that." "Get ready." "I've been ready." The pressure escalated within 48 hours. Helicopters began to appear over the ridge. Low, slow, circling. They came at unpredictable hours. Their rotor wash bent the tops of the pines and shook leaves loose. The pretext was always plausible. Survey flights, air ambulance training, forestry contractors. The actual purpose was unmistakable. They were trying to make Caleb feel watched. They were trying to make a teenager feel small. It worked some days. Other days it did not. Hollis Pruitt began to spend more time on the property. He would arrive in the gray dawn with 2 cups of black coffee from the gas station, hand one to Caleb, and walk the perimeter with him in silence. They did not speak much on those walks. They did not need to. On the 7th of those mornings, when the first frost had begun to lay a faint white powder across the high grass, Hollis stopped at the edge of the eastern ridge. He looked out at the long fold of the valley below them. He took a slow breath. "Your grandfather and I served together," he said. Caleb said nothing. He waited. Signal intelligence. Outside Berlin. We were 19, the both of us. We listened to the Soviet 8th Guards Army drink themselves to sleep and call their wives in Kiev. We sat in a concrete room 12 hours at a time, and we wore headphones until our ears bled. He was a quiet kid then, too, reading all the time, always thinking 3 steps ahead of the rest of us. He paused. "After the service, we lost touch for a while. Then about 30 years ago, when my wife got sick, an envelope showed up in my mailbox. No return address. Cash. Enough to cover her treatment. I didn't have to ask who sent it. I knew." He looked at Caleb. "He was here, son. The whole time you were in that orphanage. He was here, and I was the only one who knew. You brought him groceries. I brought him a great many things." Caleb let that sit between them. "He's gone, isn't he?" The old man nodded slowly. 18 months. He went quiet, just sat down at his desk one evening, and his heart let go. I came up the next morning, and I knew before I saw him. The bunker was already running on automatic. He'd left it the way he wanted it left. I dug the grave myself, under the white oak at the south fence, marked it with a stone. I waited. For me to turn 18, for you to come home. A long silence stretched between them in the cold morning air. "Why didn't you tell me right away?" The old man's face creased into something that was almost a smile. "Because, son, He told me you'd have to figure it out yourself or it wouldn't take. And he was right. Caleb nodded. He understood. The intrusion came on a Thursday night. The motion sensors his grandfather had installed along the eastern fence triggered at 2:14 in the morning. Caleb was awake within seconds. He had been sleeping in the bunker in the upper bunk above his sister. He pulled on his boots in the dark and was up the stairs and into the cold clearing before the second alarm cycled. There was a man at the edge of the rhododendron near the camouflaged hatch. He was crouched. He was holding a small flashlight and a device the size of a paperback book. Caleb did not shout. He moved across the clearing the way Hollis had been teaching him to move. Heel before toe, knees soft, eyes on the silhouette, not the face. The intruder did not hear him until Caleb was 4 feet behind him. When he turned, Caleb hit him across the wrist with the long maple handle of an axe he had picked up from beside the woodshed. The flashlight flew, the device hit the ground. Caleb put the head of the axe against the man's collarbone, not hard, just enough to make the geometry of the situation undeniable. The man stayed on his knees. He did not fight. He was younger than Caleb had expected. Mid-20s, nervous eyes, a soft indoor face. A face that did not belong on a mountain at 2 in the morning. "Phone," Caleb said. The man fumbled at his coat. He produced a phone with shaking hands. He held it out. Caleb did not take it. He gestured for the man to set it on the ground. He did. Caleb kicked it sideways into the leaves. He stepped back, axe still ready. "Sit," he said. The man sat. He did not run. Hollis appeared out of the dark on the other side of the clearing, shotgun broken open over his arm, an apparition who had clearly been awake for a while. "What we got?" "He had a phone," Caleb said. "That went dead." "Of course he did." Hollis crossed the clearing, bent, picked up the phone. He did something with it that Caleb did not catch. The screen lit. He looked at it for a long moment in the dark. His face did not change. It only became a fraction of a degree quieter. "Caleb." "Yeah." "You'll want to come and look at this." The most recent contact on the phone was named simply Emmy Whitaker. Caleb stared at the screen. The cold air of the clearing seemed to recede from him. The world narrowed to the small, glowing rectangle of the phone in Hollis's calloused hand. He thought about the marble office, the leather chairs, the brass key, the tour through the bunker, the 40 years of friendship with his grandfather, the slow crying in the vault. He thought about how easy it would have been, from the beginning, to put one of your own people next to a frightened 18-year-old kid, to watch the inheritance from the inside, to wait for the right moment. He felt for the first time since the lawyer's office, the floor of his world tilting. "Don't," Hollis said quietly. He had been watching Caleb's face. "Don't decide yet. Call him." Caleb walked to the satellite phone case at the rocky outcrop. He set it up with hands that were entirely steady, which surprised him because the rest of him was not. He dialed. Mortimer Whitaker answered on the second ring. His voice was thick with sleep. "Caleb, there's a man on my property. He had a phone. The most recent contact on it is your name." The silence on the other end was immediate and absolute. When the lawyer spoke again, the sleep was gone. Something else had come into his voice. Something Caleb had not heard before. It took him a moment to place it. It was grief. "What does he look like?" Caleb described the intruder. Another long silence. "Bring him down to the bunker. Lock him in the spare bunk room. Do not let him use a phone. Do not let him near a computer. I will be there in 6 hours." "Mr. Whitaker." "Yes, son." "Tell me right now." A long, shuddering breath on the other end of the line. "His name is Wendell. He is my brother's son. I raised him after my brother died. He is 26 years old. He works at my firm. He has had access to a great many things." The lawyer's voice cracked. "I am so sorry, Caleb." Caleb closed his eyes. He thought for one black second about ending the conversation, about cutting Mortimer out, about finding new counsel, about trusting no one. Then he remembered something his grandfather had written in the journal. A line he had read 3 times the first night and not understood until now. The cleanest test of a man is what he does after he discovers he has been wrong. 6 hours, Caleb said. Come alone. He ended the call. Mortimer Whitaker arrived at the road at dawn. He was not in his sedan. He was in an old pickup that Caleb had never seen before. He had not slept. The shoulders of his suit were creased. The skin under his eyes was the color of raw oysters. When he reached the clearing, he did not speak to Caleb at first. He went straight to the bunker. He went down the stairs. He stood in the doorway of the spare bunk room and looked at the young man sitting on the lower bunk who had been his nephew for 26 years and his employee for 4. Wendell would not meet his uncle's eyes. The old lawyer stood there for a very long time. When he finally turned and came back up to the study, his face had aged 5 years in a single night. He confessed, Mortimer said. He sat down heavily in the chair across from Caleb's desk. On the way down the stairs, he didn't even make me ask. They paid him. They have been paying him for 18 months. He copied case files. He copied addresses. He copied my phone records. He told them about the injunction. He told them about the forensic accountant. He told them about you. How much of what we have did he see? Nothing of substance. We were already careful. But he gave them enough to know we are serious. And tonight he was sent to confirm the location of the bunker entrance. He was carrying a GPS marker. Mortimer's hands shook in his lap. Caleb, I will resign as your counsel. Right now, I will turn over every file. I will help you find new representation. Caleb watched the older man for a long moment. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about the journal. He thought about the line about being wrong. No, sir. The lawyer looked up. You're going to keep working for me? Caleb, and you're going to use him. A pause. What? He's a channel. He's their eyes inside your firm. We can put information into him and it will arrive at Meridian within hours. We can use that. We can move them. We can make them act before they're ready. Mortimer Whitaker stared at his client for a long moment. Then slowly, very slowly, the old lawyer began to nod. Your grandfather, he said quietly, would have liked you a great deal, son. The two of them spent the next 4 hours at the desk in the study mapping out exactly which lies they were going to plant, in which order, on which dates to bring Meridian into open ground. Wendell was released the next afternoon with no charges, no police report, no public consequence. He was told only that he was lucky and that he had work to do. He drove away with a face that suggested he did not yet understand he had become a different kind of asset entirely. The trap had been turned. The siege deepened. Helicopters became routine. The flat black SUVs at the end of the public road did not bother to leave. Twice in the next month, Hollis intercepted men attempting to cross the western fence at night. He did not shoot them. He did not need to. He simply stood up out of the underbrush in front of them with a shotgun and a face that had spent 2 years in Berlin learning to look at people, and they turned around and went home. But the planted information was working. Mortimer fed Wendell a series of carefully crafted lies about the location of the proof, the identity of cooperating witnesses, and the timing of the federal complaint. Wendell faithfully delivered them to his handlers. Meridian moved on each lie. They subpoenaed empty file rooms. They surveilled witnesses who did not exist. They wired bank accounts that had been opened for the purpose of being noticed, and every move they made left a trail. The forensic accountant began to assemble those trails into a federal indictment. One night in late autumn, Hollis came up the dirt path at a faster pace than Caleb had ever seen him move. The old man's face was set. There were tire tracks at the eastern fence this morning. Wendell, no, heavier, off-road, 3 vehicles. They came in just before dawn and turned around without stopping. Caleb felt the cold air of the clearing settle around him. They're not sending lawyers anymore. No, son, they are not. He went back into the bunker that night and walked to the study. He sat down at his grandfather's desk. He looked at the stack of cassette tapes. There was one tape at the very bottom of the stack he had not yet played, Its label read in the same neat block hand as the others, but in red ink, only open if you have to fight. He held it in his hands for a long moment. Then he pushed it into the deck and pressed play. His grandfather's voice filled the room. Caleb, if you are listening to this tape, then either I have miscalculated or you are a great deal more stubborn than I dared hope. I suspect the latter. A pause. In the top drawer of this desk is a sealed envelope. Inside it is a list of 8 names. Each of these men served with me at one point in my life. Each of them is alive. Each of them owes me a kind of debt that does not appear on any ledger. I have helped them quietly over the past 3 decades. None of them know about this place. None of them know the others are on this list. But each of them has agreed separately to come if I ever called. A breath. I never called. I would not pull them into my fight, but you may. The bunker has a ham radio in the cabinet behind the bookshelf. The frequency is on the back of the envelope. If you transmit your name and the words White Oak, they will come. A long pause. They are old men now, Caleb. So am I. We were not old when we were young together, but we were good at what we did. Use them only if you must. And remember this, they are not soldiers under your command. They are friends of your grandfather. Treat them so. The tape clicked off. Caleb sat at the desk for a long time. Then he opened the drawer. He found the envelope. He carried it up the stairs into the cold autumn night, set up the radio antenna and read his grandfather's name and his own, and the words White Oak into the dark. They came within 48 hours, 4 of them. The other 4 were too sick or too far. 4 was enough. Eldon Brennan came first in a battered diesel truck with a topper all the way from southern Indiana. He was a tall, lean man in his late 60s with a silver beard cropped close and the careful walk of a former Army medic. He had served with Walter at the Berlin listening post. He stepped out of his truck, looked at the clearing, looked at Caleb, looked at Hollis, and said only Witt's grandson. It was not a question. The others arrived over the next 36 hours, 2 men and a third in a van who had driven through the night from Kentucky. They were all in their 60s or early 70s. They were all quiet. They were all the kind of men who had spent a lifetime being underestimated by people who looked at their gray hair and stopped looking. They did not behave like an army. They behaved like family. Doc Brennan made coffee on the camp stove. The man from Kentucky walked the perimeter with Hollis. The 2 from the van set up an antenna array on the southern ridge that Caleb did not pretend to understand. Doc Brennan came to him on the second evening. They were sitting on the porch of the shed watching the sun go down through the gap in the pines. Your grandfather paid for my daughter's chemotherapy, he said, 1994. We didn't have insurance. I didn't have anywhere to go. An envelope showed up in my mailbox. No return address, $22,000 in cash. She lived. She is 53 years old now. She has 3 children of her own. He looked at Caleb. You point, I follow. Caleb nodded. He did not trust his voice. The attack came on a Saturday night. 3 vehicles, 11 men, professional. They came up the western fence line with night vision optics and suppressed weapons. They moved in 3 coordinated teams. They were not police. They were not federal. They were paid. They were also being watched. Doc Brennan and the man from Kentucky picked them up on the perimeter sensors at 11:42 p.m. Hollis took up a position on the eastern ridge with a rifle older than Caleb. The 2 men from the van turned on a set of low, powerful floodlights that lit the entire western approach as bright as a baseball field. The 11 attackers walked into the light. They stopped. They saw 4 old men spaced along the ridge. They saw one young man at the center standing in front of a camouflaged hatch with a shotgun broken open over his arm. They saw behind the young man a small girl in a doorway lit from below, watching them with a stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest. They saw the geometry of the situation. They did not fire. Their team leader keyed his radio for a long minute. Whoever was on the other end of that radio gave him an order. They withdrew. Caleb stood in the floodlights for a long time after the last of them had melted back into the trees. The rifle in his hand was steady. His heart was not. Doc Brennan came up beside him finally and put a calloused hand on his shoulder. "They will not come again," Doc said. "Not like this. They know now." "Know what?" "That you are not alone." The collapse came 2 weeks later, and it came from a direction Caleb had not anticipated. A man knocked on Mortimer Whitaker's office door in Pittsburgh on a Tuesday morning. He was thin. He wore a brown suit that fit poorly. His name was Roland Fletcher. He told Mortimer that he had been the chief internal accountant at Meridian Holdings Group for 22 years. He told him that he had watched the entire architecture of the fraud from the inside from a desk on the 38th floor. He told him that his wife was a woman named Margaret Fletcher, that her maiden name had been Whitfield, that her cousin once removed had been a young woman named Rebecca Whitfield, who had married a young man named Daniel Hadley, that he had been at their wedding, that he had held Caleb as a baby, that he had spent 18 years knowing exactly what had been done to Daniel and Rebecca on Route 19 and exactly who had ordered it, that he had not been able to live with himself for any of those 18 years, that when he had read the redacted public filings of the sealed lawsuit, he had understood that someone in the family had finally come back, that the sign he had been waiting for all those years had arrived, that he was prepared to testify, that he was prepared to bring with him the original ledgers of Meridian Holdings Group, which he had been quietly photocopying one page at a time for 18 years. The whole world cracked open. Mortimer brought Roland Fletcher to the bunker the next day. The old accountant sat across from Caleb in the study, in the same chair Mortimer had wept in, and could not for a long moment speak. He looked at Caleb's face. He looked very carefully for someone in that face. "You have your mother's eyes," he said finally. Caleb said nothing. "She and Margaret used to write each other letters when you were small. She sent us a picture the day you were born. It was on our refrigerator. For years." Roland Fletcher's hands were folded tight in his lap. "I'm so sorry, son. I should have spoken 18 years ago. I told myself I had a wife to protect. I told myself there was nothing I could prove. I told myself a great many things that were not true." Caleb watched him for a long moment. He thought about Sophie asleep in the bunk room. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about his father. "Mr. Fletcher, yes, you're here now." The old accountant lowered his face into his hands. After a long time, he looked up. "I have copies of every transaction Meridian has ever processed, going back to 1986. They are in a self-storage unit in Allentown. I have keys. I have an access code. Whenever you say the word." Caleb looked across the desk at Mortimer Whitaker. The old lawyer's eyes were wet. "Say the word, son. Say it." The complaint went federal that week. The story broke in the New York Times on a Sunday morning, front page above the fold. The combined evidence of Walter Hadley's hard drive, Roland Fletcher's 18 years of photocopies, and the corroborating testimony of 3 other internal witnesses pulled a lid off Meridian Holdings Group that no public relations apparatus could close. The stock collapsed in pre-market trading. By Tuesday, it had been suspended. By Friday, the FBI had unsealed indictments against 14 executives. The first arrest was Thaddeus Sterling, taken from his office in Lower Manhattan on a Thursday afternoon in a charcoal suit, in front of cameras the Bureau had carefully made sure were present. The federal hearings ran for 16 months. Caleb attended every day he could. He wore his grandfather's old olive field jacket. The dog tag stayed under his shirt. On the day Thaddeus Sterling was finally allowed to make a statement before sentencing, Caleb sat in the second row of the courtroom. He stood up when his turn at the lectern came. He looked at the man in the silver hair and the expensive suit who had once ordered the deaths of 2 people Caleb had never gotten to know. He did not raise his voice. "My father's name was Daniel Hadley." The room was silent. "My mother's name was Rebecca Hadley." Sterling did not look up. "I just wanted you to hear those names in this room before they sentence you." He sat back down. The federal court awarded the Hadley estate $4.7 million dollars in whistleblower damages after legal fees. Caleb refused in a final filing. The last buyout offer, Meridian's bankruptcy estate, sent for the 500 acres. He kept the land. The house went up the following spring. He hired a small crew of local men out of Hollow Ridge County. He worked alongside them every day. He learned to use a chalk line. He learned to read a level. He learned the patience of a hand-laid stone foundation. Hollis worked beside him most days. Doc Brennan came back twice that summer to help with the framing. It was not a mansion. It was a sturdy, modest house of cedar and local stone on the ridge where Sophie had once pointed and said, "What if we built a house here?" It had wide windows that flooded the rooms with afternoon light. The front door was painted a deep, calm blue. The bunker stayed. He did not seal it. He cleaned it. He maintained the ventilation. He turned the study into a library. The cassette tapes stayed in their stack. The leather journal stayed on the desk. The dog tags came down from his neck only when Sophie asked once to hold them. He let her. She gave them back. Walter Hadley's grave under the white oak was rebuilt with a proper stone. Daniel and Rebecca were exhumed from the city cemetery in Pittsburgh and laid beside him in the family ground. Caleb stood at the foot of those three graves on a cold spring morning and said the things he had not been able to say out loud at any other time. Sophie enrolled at the public school in Hollow Ridge in the fall. She joined the science club. She made friends slowly, the way she did everything. By the end of her first year, she was running the bird banding program out of the boys' restroom window, which had a clear view of the eastern feeder. Caleb did not go away to college. He enrolled in the State University's online program from the desk in the new living room. He started with business and economics. He moved within a year to law. Mortimer became his unlikely mentor. The old lawyer drove out to Hollow Ridge once a month until his hip got bad, and then once a season, and then when he could no longer make the trip, sent letters in a hand that grew shakier each year, but never less precise. Hollis Pruitt and Doc Brennan moved into a cabin a quarter of a mile down the ridge. They had decided separately, without consulting each other, that home was the place where you could see the smoke from the next chimney over. On a long blue evening in late autumn when Caleb was 20 and Sophie was 12, the four of them sat on the porch of the new house. The valley below was filling with shadow. The sun was painting the western ridge a slow gradient of orange and violet. Hollis and Doc each held a cup of black coffee. Sophie sat cross-legged on the porch boards, drawing a hawk in her notebook. Caleb stood at the railing. The dog tags rested cool against his sternum under his shirt. The blue door behind him stood open to let in the last warm air of the day. He thought about the brass key, the gray shack, the lawyer's office in Pittsburgh, the bus through the mountains, the cassette tape on the desk, the wall of money, the 10-year-old girl in a borrowed coat who had said, "We have to be brave too." He thought about a grandfather who had spent 10 years in a concrete room beneath his own children, choosing to be misunderstood every day so that his grandchildren would be allowed to grow up. He thought about what an inheritance really was. It was not 500 acres. It was not a steel door under a stone. It was not even $4.7 million from a federal court. It was a story you were given, and the choice at the end of it of what kind of man you would let it make of you. Home, he understood now, was not a thing you were handed. It was a thing you fought for. It was a thing you built with your own hands, with the help of people who chose to stand beside you on a piece of ground that knew your name. He turned to look at his sister. She looked up from her notebook and smiled at him. The light was very soft. The wind moved in the pines. Somewhere down the ridge, a hawk called. Caleb Hadley, 18, no longer stood on his own porch on his own land, in a house with a blue door beside the people who had chosen to come and to stay and watch the sun go down over a valley that, after a great deal of patience and a great deal of cost, had become the only word he had ever needed. Home.